Okay. Try this again. So we're going to be looking at the connection in Melanesia culture of the natural world and ancestral roots, right? So there are two artworks for the Malagan display. So we have these upright posts and then we have these masks. And so have you seen anything like this before? What did you discuss? Yes. They look an awful lot like totem poles. Yes, they do. And so it kind of makes sense that we think about Pacific Northwest, right? We think of like Indigenous America in Canada and in the northern United States, that there be some similarities with some of these islands. Isn't that interesting, right? So they do have stacked imagery very similar to totem poles, right? So these were created in New Ireland, and they were created for the hot and dry season. And so basically, a lot of these kind of tropical climates, let me close this door. A lot of these tropical climates don't necessarily think about like, you know, winter, spring, summer, fall. We normally think about wet and dry season. And so during the dry season, they basically are preparing for the wet season. And so they will, you know, they live in like modest towns on islands. They live mostly in rural villages and they're agricultural. So they grow potatoes and cassava and bananas and different kinds of greens, and then taro. So taro is kind of like a potato root. You probably have seen that before. They raise things like pigs, right? And they feed them coconut meat so that they're nice and sweet and they taste, if you like pigs, they taste real good. And then of course they fish, right? And when the dry season arrives, this is a time of very elaborate feast. And so we'll talk a little bit about those. Okay, so that's just a little bit of the background information on these people. Right? So when you look at the posts, and of course we have, right, a series of posts here, we don't really have a close-up, right? So I found a close-up for you. It's probably from Smart History. And so when you look at it, you can see that it has vertically stacked imagery. It's carved out of wood, right? And there's a contrast in color and texture. So notice that there's a lot of outlining of the shapes, right? And then there's kind of like filling in of those shapes as well to kind of highlight the different parts. So eyes, fangs, you know, headdress, hair, that sort of thing. This is made by a specific person in the community. So there are skilled carvers in the communities who seclude themselves from the rest of the village. So they kind of work in secret. They kind of work without people really, you know, seeing what they're creating. And they carve these for special occasions. They use hard things like seashells and stone, knives, shark teeth. They even use some fire in order to carve out some of these. Fire is a great way of getting big chunks out because it makes the wood more brittle. Okay, and then of course they painted them with natural pigments. Of course now artificial pigment is very common, but back, you know, when these were being used the most, they would use the pigments that they had in their natural environment. So of course we see mostly blacks and whites and earth colors, right? So they would make these out of the driftwood that they would find, right? So this was often made out of driftwood, and the carver supposedly saw these images in his dreams, right? So if we think about that he saw them in his dreams, there should be like some sort of spiritual connection with the carver and what he makes. Okay, so some sort of interrelationship. Okay, remember once again, as you're jotting down, bullet points are fine. I'm trying to lessen information on here or highlight the most things. You don't have to write all of that last sentence. Okay. So who do these posts represent and why are there so many? Does anyone know from the reading who these posts represent? Yeah, Andy. The deceased. So, whoops. So a Malagan means likeness. So the Malagan means likeness. It also means to carve and to inscribe, which I think is fascinating. And so they would, in the dry season, have a communal feast. And basically what they would do is they would have a meal, they would have a feast to honor those who died in the last year. So it's kind of like a communal funeral. Okay. This way, they could pool all their resources, right? Instead of it costing my family thousands of dollars to put on a funeral, we'll all put our resources together and celebrate our ancestors together, right? So it's a communal feast to honor those who passed away. They probably make nods as well to other ancestors who have passed on in previous, but the main focus is on the people who died this past year. And so when you look at them, once again, they're not realistic. You don't go, oh, that's Uncle Ed and he passed away, right? We have those animal spirits that represent the family, right? Or we have abstractions that represent that person rather than a realistic depiction of the actual person. So it's like symbols of that person, right? So here's some other examples from the Met. The Met has a great example of these. They do vary in shape and size based on the location because Papua New Guinea isn't an enormous place, but there's different villages. So they have different styles. They could be a mask-like thing. They could be a wooden board or frieze, which basically means it's like a horizontal element rather than just vertical. The most common is kind of these sturdy, like vertical house poles, but they also could be something as simple as a mat, right? Some woven sort of mat that represents the deceased. I have a feeling that was probably for people who had less money to have such an elaborate thing carved, is my thought. And then when you look at them, there's all different kinds of animals, right? Humans and animals incorporated in that. So snakes and crocodiles, birds, fish, all kind of abstracted and put together. A lot of these are common food sources for the area, and so on. Okay, so we talked about a lot of this already. Probably the thing to basically know is the Mai, right? He's the cultural leader for the people of New Ireland. And so basically he organizes it. He decides, right? He basically directs all the people of the community on specific jobs for things to do. So he, is kind of in charge. So he coordinates the entire event. He decides what pigs will be slaughtered and when they will be slaughtered for the feast. He'll send people out to fish to get food to supply for the feast. He also is kind of in charge of organizing people to sing and to dance during the festivities. He probably is also coordinating with the carvers to make sure everything is ready to go when it comes time. And he coordinates the money, right? So he's someone who helps to pool the resources from all of the different family members. So let's look at the setting of these sculptures. Since they gave us more than one, and that you can see they're kind of arranged, does anyone kind of, like, how would you describe where they're placed? How would you describe this? Anyone have words this morning? On Tuesday morning? Yeah.
Like,
here.
it looks like they're like guarding this enclosure.
They do. They look like they're guarding this enclosure. They represent the dead, and they're kind of like set up on a stage. So during the feast, they're in a place of honor. And so they're kind of elevated, they're kind of out of the way. There's kind of like this, and you can see it's not like it's a sturdy temple by any means, but they're just there to watch and observe the festivities. And there it does appear to be some sort of entryway, so they do kind of appear like guardian figures as well, which kind of makes sense. Our ancestors look over us, right? The poles represent the dead. Now, at the end of the feast, these poles are allowed to deteriorate and rot. What could be the significance of that? Go ahead and chit chat with your neighbors. Why might the people let these posts deteriorate and rot?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I heard good answers. Who would like to share? Who would like to share? Go ahead.
I think because like the dead that they're offering also will eventually rot. So it's like
It could represent their physical death. Could it represent something else besides their physical death? Yeah, for sure. Right. So they're letting their spirit and their physical body move on to another world, right? So that's just the posts. The masks are reused, right? So we're going to get to the masks next, right? So these are the masks, and just like we talked about the booth masks, these are not things that are just worn to the festival. They're a part of ceremony. And so this is a very dated film, and I probably have to pause the video, but if you're absent, click on this link, because I probably don't have copyright for it. So you can see from the video that the masks are worn in those dances, and they talked about the idea that it's choreographed, right? It's choreographed and they're in unison, right? What does the unity part of the dance represent to the community? What does that represent? Why would that be so important? Any educated guesses? Yeah.
I mean, this might be off, but like with the feast, like the locals all pool their resources to honor them. Like it's a very communal experience, so that might go hand in hand. Like they kind of bear an equal responsibility to honor the ancestors and that be a part of it.
Exactly. It shows that they work in harmony with each other, right? So they work in harmony, and it shows once again this powerful Maimai, this ruler, that he's able to achieve this, right? And we're actually going to get, when we go to Pacific Northwest culture, we're going to see very similar feasts where there's a leader, and they kind of show up the community's wealth and power by being able to have these big communal feasts. They call them potlatches in the Pacific Northwest. And we'll talk about those later, right? So we're showing the harmony of the society through the dance. We're showing the sense of community. And even when they showed at the end with the feast, it shows the prosperity of the community too, right? That they're able to collect all of those pigs to roast and to exchange. So there's often the exchange of almost like presents, okay? And we'll see this once again in the Pacific Northwest. So the masks, you can see that they range in shapes and colors. The one that we have is an illustration of a mask. I don't know why they include it. This is the one from Smart History instead. And so you get kind of an idea. It looks kind of interesting to me. If you look at the face, it has a bunch of series of stripes. It kind of reminds me of tattooing. I don't know if this culture, this is something I probably should look up. I don't know if this culture tattoos. I mean, that's common in New Zealand and Australia, but it kind of looks like it is. And then any educated guess what this circular thing at the top could possibly represent? Does anyone know? How does it relate to the natural world? Maybe that's a hint, Rashida. When they dance, they look like birds, right? And so it almost has a plume to it. Anyone else? Yes. Right. It supposedly represents the sun. Very good. And also, you know, how it connects with the natural world is the bird movement in the dance, which of course a lot of ancestry is related to birds. Birds are always a good representation of your ancestors because birds fly and they can observe and watch over all of us. They watch over the world, right? And so it also has natural materials. So if you were having an essay about how this represents the natural world, you could talk about the sun sort of shape, the sun motif, but you also could talk about the materials that are woven together to make the mask. So these masks are very elaborate and they are reused every single year. So they're protected so that they don't deteriorate. Okay, so keeping in mind that we have two of these masks and they look a little bit different from each other. This one definitely has those ancestral animal characteristics, whereas this one is more based on, you know, the natural world in terms of like sun, that sort of thing. Okay. There's other polls. These are from the ASMAT people. These are kind of interesting. These are polls. These are not in the 250, by the way. These are polls that are in place in front of a building. It's kind of like a fraternity. It's like a male society, and they're stuck in their, like in the front of it, kind of like flag poles. And so here you can see them erecting them. And when you look at them, they're stacked on top of each other. And these are images of captives. They're images of captives. These people were headhunters and supposedly also participated in cannibalism. And sometimes the heads are gone and kept inside like storage areas in between legs and arms and strangely enough. And when, oh, I must have deleted one of them. The images, right, have like phallic-like symbolism to them to express male power. Right, so these kind of totems are common, but they serve different functions. They're not always funerary related. That's a good thing to know when you go to a museum and see different kinds of codes. Okay, so we're going to jump, right? We are still in the Pacific, still in the Pacific. We're in 234. Now, I put this in this note taker for section 9 for you, but this is really a part of unit 10. This is from our global contemporary unit. But I love Emily Kngwarreye's work because it really does kind of fit in with her cultural background. So at your tables, can you guys like look at this painting, and if you did any of the readings, how does it appear she made this? How does it appear she made this? What art elements are emphasized and how is it arranged? So just take a few moments to discuss those three questions. some words you could use just to describe how it looks like the paint was applied? What are some words you can use?
In the reading, it said she was trying to
She was trying to make what? This is not a sand painting, but it comes from that tradition. So in Australia and other islands in the Pacific, even the American Southwest, we do this. It's very common to do sand painting. And so when you think about a grain of sand, it's really just a small dot, right? And they would sprinkle it and put it into different shapes. And it was often done in this kind of dreamy kind of state, or to represent one's dreams, right? And so when you look at her piece, right, and how she works, what's the basic element that you can emphasize, you can point out? Ooh, I kind of used the word there. How is the paint applied? What do you think? How's the paint applied? Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
It's like dotted on.
It's dotted on. So you see lines, you see dots, and so it's not a super realistic like imagery, right? It's kind of like the precisely placed dots. And so she would sit on the ground and put in these precisely placed dots. And you can see her working incredibly large, right? Incredibly large. This link here basically is a museum talking about her work. Her painting, she's probably the most famous Australian painter. She passed away a few years ago. And she sold her paintings for like the most money. So it was like record breaking for Australia. And so this gives you a little idea about the scale of this painting. They are enormous, right? At least this one is enormous. Some of her other works are not this big, right? But this painting is quite large. And so if we look at, I want to make sure we addressed all those questions, thinking about how it's arranged, does there seem to be an area that's like emphasized here? Like, does your eye go somewhere? Remember when we were talking about what is emphasized, what's the focal point? And we're like, oh, imagery of power, because it's centered, or the lighting. Is there any area of this that seems to stand out to you? Is that your answer, Anne?
Like, I don't know, like the darker like spot that kind of comes across from the left stands out a little bit, but nothing like has that too much.
No, it's like an overall sort of pattern. And even though there's different applications of paint, you know, you've got areas where there's a lot of dots, right? You got some areas that are a little flatter. There really isn't an area for your eye to land, right? So I wonder why she did that, right? Part of it represents what she's getting at, right? So we'll break this down into different parts here, okay? So the colors, right? The colors that she's representing is about the wet season. She comes from an area in Australia that is extremely dry. Actually, if I go back to here, she is from Central Australia. Very, very, very dry, right? And so in the time where it's wet in her land that she grew up in, it does get green in places and flowers. And so she wanted to represent where she lived in this beautiful, lush, wet season. So she's using colors. Now, she was a contemporary painter, and so she knew about the history of art, right? And so often her work is compared to Claude Monet. This is an enormous painting at the Met, very similar in size to hers, right? In Monet, as we will learn, was not just about painting pretty landscapes. He was really looking at seasonal and temporal change. How does color change during different times of the year? How does color change in different times of the day, right? So he was observing the natural world, just like her. So if you were in that comparison section, towards the top under style, you could say her work is similar to Claude Monet's, right? In that it's analyzing color during a particular time in the year. Okay, thank goodness we have something we can compare to that you probably know something about, because everyone knows the Impressionists, right? So they're large, right? And they've got that color. Okay, so we said she's from Central Australia, and she comes from a tradition. She actually was a revered elder in her community, and she took up painting really late in life. I think she was in her 70s, and she died in her late 80s, right? So really her career was only about 20 years. She was already an established elder. She was revered. She told stories to her community about their past. So she talked about their oral tradition. She was trained in sand painting, right? As well as ritual dream painting. Ritual dream painting that's typical of Australia looks like this, right? This is not sand, this is painting of dreams. Once again, those dotted and linear elements to them, right? This is our textbook, but not by her. And often these representations of dreaming are also connected with song, storytelling, and dancing, right? So there's this kind of woven community, right, with when you create a sand painting or a dream painting, right? And that's the tradition in which she is coming from. She also had the job of painting bodies of women for some of these celebrations. Right? That's all for her. Questions on that? One thing to note, because I'm here, is that sometimes at the end of the slides, I have additional notes on things. Some of it's repetitive. This is some of it's just given to me from other people. So sometimes you can find extra notes at the end of the section. Okay, we're going to move to Micronesia culture and look at their connection with the natural world. Same thing, just different location. Climate change cartoon there. Okay, so we're in Micronesia, so we're in this triangle at the top, right? It is west of Hawaii, right? And we have this interesting figure. It is called female deity. Once again, forgot to put the number up there, so I'm sorry about that. It's in the 200s. It's close by. 217. Thank you so much. I really have to go through and edit this. Okay. So this is from the Caroline Islands. And so this is an image of a woman. Describe how it's abstracted and stylized. Go ahead and discuss. This is an image of a woman. How is it abstracted and stylized? Just reviewing some important vocabulary that we talked about. Okay. Is there anything about this that says it's a woman? What about this makes it look female? Is there anything about this that makes it look female? Not really, right? This is pretty much just a person, right? These were often clothed. So this is missing its clothing and its jewelry, right? So this doesn't have any of that. But let's just focus on the abstraction and the stylized. What does that mean? Abstract and stylized. Yeah. Right. So it's distorted reality. I don't look at that and go, well, that's Christina, right? Doesn't it look just like her, right? No, it doesn't. right? It looks like a person. It's got a head, it's got shoulders, it's got a torso, it's got a waist, it's got legs. It doesn't have feet. It barely has hands, right? But we know it's human, right? It's anthropomorphic in a way, right? But it's not a realistic depiction of reality, right? Okay, so if you were going to describe this in really basic vocabulary, this could be the content. These sculptures typically have ovoid heads. So oval shaped heads, tubular necks, right? They kind of look like columns. They're pretty, like they don't really like undulate, right? They're just like cylinders. They often have slits for the eyes and the nose. Here I basically just see the eyes, right? This is a different one. You can see this one has a little bit more, right? The shoulders tend to slope downward and simply have just a simple line for the chest. Now, not all of these sculptures are female. Ours happens to be female, but there are male versions as well. There's basic indication of hands and feet, and they tend to have flat buttocks, right? So from the back view, you guys don't have the back view in your image, but you have the front, but that's what it looks like from the back. So tiny little butt, kind of flat. Okay, so we know who they are, or at least people knew who they were because of how they were like organized. So their setting. So you actually, do you have, no, you don't have a setting. This could be contextual. These were placed in an altar. So they were placed in an altar. They would have had clothing and objects that decorated them, right? They're made out of wood and they would be decorated. And that's how the people would know who they were. And all of this comes from an oral tradition. So things passed down generation by generation through storytelling rather than written. Okay. They believe that deities existed inside these carvings, right? And that's why they placed them in places of honor. So they would place them in temples and they would decorate the areas, not only, you know, put them in clothing, but they would use woven mats and feathers. They'd often paint the area, they'd have headdresses, and they were in an area in this like little temple that was important in like it was in an important location, right, in the village. And so it was connected with religious ceremony. So supposedly it took place in the month of Malagan, which I have no idea what time of year that is. So they were often used in a specific time of the year. I think that's probably good. Right? So what is it made of and how might the material be significant? It says it's made from wood, right? And so that's all you really need to memorize. But the kind of wood is important to that culture, right? It's made from breadfruit tree, right? And it was carved with shells and metal blades once they got people to import them to them, right? And the reason the material is important is the rituals that are associated with the sculptures often relate to the beginning of the harvesting of taro, right? Breadfruit, where the tree comes from, arrowroot, banana, sugar cane, nuts, I don't even know what that is, nuts, and coconuts, right? So their food sources, it was related to their time of the harvest, which is probably, right, this time is probably the harvest season. They're very smooth and they're very shiny. So they would use pumice. I don't know how many of you guys know what pumice stone is. It's kind of this very porous rock. Often they use it for like scraping dead skin off with your feet and things like that. But it would be really great sandpaper. And then they oil it with to a shine, right? With some of the oils that come from, coconut and so on, things that they accumulate in their environment. So they would often give these things as offerings to these deity images, right? So they would make food offerings, they would perform dances. During this festivity, women were often tattooed. And then, like I said, these sculptures were considered to be deities, but they could also be the final resting place of a god or a deified ancestor, right? Because ancestors could become deities, right? They were good enough. And then lastly, as I let you guys jot around, you don't need to worry about this, but by 1870, right, they basically stopped following these gods because of the rise of Christianity in the area. These temples, right, live in buildings that look sort of like this. Now, a lot of this vocabulary is all about this guy here, so you don't need to know the name of the deity. We don't know the name of the deity for a female deity, but this one, I think it's from some of the research. He has a name, and he was housed in one of these community buildings. And so you can get kind of an idea what they look like on the outside and the inside. Right? We'll start with our navigation chart tomorrow. Okay, we'll start with our navigation chart tomorrow. And then I will spend some time really looking and making sure that we can get to our quiz on Friday. This one goes really fast. There's not a lot to talk about this one. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is very weird.